I just want to quickly introduce one of the students who's been working with us to really help implement our energy programming on campus this month, and that's Sassy Dale, who will then introduce our speaker.
Hi, so I'm one of the resident Green Eagles for Anderson, or the resident Green Eagle for Anderson, but I work for the Office of Sustainability. So we're very excited to have Mr. Harper here. So he is the Global Director of the Environment and Energy Policy at Intel Corporation. He also serves as co-chairman of the Digital Energy and Sustainability Solutions Campaign, a coalition of leading IT companies and energy efficiency advocacy groups focused on the role of IT in driving energy efficiency and sustainability solutions in the US, China, and India. He also serves as chairman of the International Climate Change Partnership. In his Intel capacity, Mr. Harper advises senior management and oversees a staff that manages all of the company's interactions with governments around the world related to the environmental and energy performance of its factories and products. Prior to Intel, Mr. Harper served as a senior regulatory manager for the Amoco Oil Company and was senior policy advisor at the EPA. He's also served as vice president of ICF Consulting as a policy analyst with the Colorado Legislative Council and as a project manager for the California State Coastal Conservatory. Mr. Harper's education includes a bachelor's degree from the University of Colorado, where he graduated with highest honors. He also has a master's in international affairs from Princeton University and an MBA from the University of Colorado. So, welcome, Mr. Harper.
I should have sent my my shorter bio, which just says Prime Minister of Canada.
That would have been good.
Yeah. I'm just going to talk from here. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. This is a real pleasure. We have a sabbatical program, so every 7 years you get 2 months off. And I was telling somebody earlier, usually people travel, or take their kids someplace. I put on 120,000 miles on United Airlines. So far this year, I have no interest in traveling any place. My kids are all in college or out of college, so they certainly don't want me to come visit them. So I've been doing a couple of things on my sabbatical, doing a little bit of lecturing here, thanks to Dan Fiorino, who I've worked with over the years, both at EPA and since, and then doing a little bit of work on some land conservation and water quality issues with a group called the Chesapeake Conservancy. But mostly I get up in the morning and say, oh, I've got to be in Annapolis at 9 a.m. I said, no, I don't. I'm a volunteer. I can be there at 10 a.m. I'm gonna give a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago to a group in Denver. The content is pretty much the same as I wanted to present here. Please interrupt me. This is not meant to be a diatribe. I wanted to engage conversation. What I'm going to talk about, intuitively people understand that these devices use energy. And that the more of these devices and smartphones and other IT devices there are, the more energy they consume. People also understand that it takes water to make a microchip. It takes water to make these products. What is less well understood, but I think more significant for reasons I'll mention in a second, is that these devices and other devices, various form factors, network together. If they're used intelligently, can, whether it's on a campus or in a family or in a business or for a country, can save much, much greater amounts of energy through what we call systemic efficiency or intelligent efficiency, and what we sometimes call the macro story. The micro story is the efficiency of the device. The macro story is how those devices network together and intelligently used can save a lot more energy and water for that matter. So there's a macro story on the water side, and I'll talk a little bit about that, what I'm doing in Chesapeake when I'm done. So, it's clear that if the, little bit of blip in the last 3 or 4 years because of the economic crisis, but it's clear we're, as as a world, we're on a trajectory that's unsustainable, and the only way we're going to get to a point where we can sustain economic growth globally is if we are a lot smarter, a lot less resource intensive in the way we go about our daily lives. And, you know, it's intuitive, and if you travel to places like India and China and Vietnam, as I have, people in those countries want to live like we do. And, you know, I think morally, ethically, we're not in a position to tell them no, you can't. And so as those countries increasingly start to join the developed world, that puts even more pressure on the need for us as a global society to be a smart society. Various folks like McKinsey and Gartner consultants have taken a look at what the footprint, the energy and climate footprint of the ICT industry is. The C here is communication, so I'm including traditional computing, smartphones, and all the infrastructure that goes along with our connectivity. And there are debates about this, but most of them come out and say that between the energy used and the embedded energy, right, the energy that's embedded in the manufacture of all the devices and the networks, the ICT industry's footprint is about 2% of the world's footprint. It's going to be bigger in developed countries where there's more ICT infrastructure, you know, more connectivity. But give or take, you know, I think that's a ballpark figure. Most of the emphasis of governments historically have been on the 2%, on making the devices more efficient. I've spent 15 years at Intel working, for example, on Energy Star and working on similar energy efficiency requirements in places like the European Union and Korea and China. And it used to be, if you did a life cycle assessment, you know, if you're familiar with that idea, you look at a product and its impact from the mining of the materials to the disposal at the end of life. 6-7 years ago, if you looked at the life cycle climate and energy footprint of an ICT device, you would tell a government, if you're going to focus on the energy consumed during the use of that device, because that's where the biggest impact was. Today, these devices, in part because they're mobile and the form factor requires long-term battery life, and they have to be cool. The drive towards mobile devices has really incentivized a tremendous amount of innovation in our industry to make these devices very efficient. And so now, if you look at the life cycle of this product, for example, this is about 2 years old. The amount of footprint that's in the use phase is very, very small. So you want to look at other aspects of the life cycle. And as you get to more mobile form factors, the ultrabooks that you'll see advertised now, or tablets, or smartphones, even more so, the electricity in the use is a smaller and smaller part of it. But one of my key messages is this picture, if the story I'm going to tell today turns out to be true, and we realize the picture I'm going to paint, you know, 5-10 years from now, the ICT slice is going to be much bigger. It's going to be much bigger for a couple of reasons. One, more than half the world is not connected, and they want to be connected. Two, we are inventing new form factors all the time. And, you know, we're all hard-pressed, even some of the futurists in an industry and companies like mine are hard-pressed to tell you what they think the devices are going to look like in 5 or 10 years. But also because if the story I'm telling you gets realized, we're going to be able to use our devices to reduce the 98% significantly. So the key is, for the size of the pie is going to shrink, but the relative portions should grow over time, and I would argue that's a good thing. So, you know, we're moving to a situation, at least for the portion of the world that's connected, where, you know, we're swamped by transistors. This shows the growth over a 10-year period ending in 2010, 68% compound annual growth rate in the number of transistors shipped, embedded in devices that we're using. If if you'll notice, the slope of that curve is increasing, not decreasing. Because of innovations in our industry to make the devices, whether it's the chips or the systems themselves more efficient, and what I mentioned before, the move towards mobile form factors, our projection is the first billion PCs there on the left that were shipped by the end of the year 2007. You can see the energy consumption and compute capacity. Between 2007 and 2014, we think we're going to double or triple the number. So we're going to go from 1 billion shipped to 3 billion shipped. But that second 2 billion computers that get shipped between 2007 and 2014, on average, are going to be much richer in terms of compute capacity, but also much more energy efficient. So you're going to have half the energy consumed in the second 2 billion that you had in the first billion. If I haven't confused you on the numbers there. That's at the system level. If you look at the chip level, and that's, we make chips, so that's where we tend to focus. This is an effort to take different technologies and compare different metrics of energy efficiency. And so you want to get a unit of work divided by a unit of energy input. So during the period 1978 to 2008 in the U.S., automobiles on average, measured on miles per gallon, improved their efficiency by about 40%. You can see, for different industries and different technologies, the improvements in other sectors. In terms of the computation per watt, microchips, the CPUs that run computers, over that same period improved their efficiency by almost 3 million %. So, significant improvement. And that really is about Moore's Law. And most of you probably know Moore's Law, named after the man who formulated it, one of the founders of Intel. And Moore's Law is not a law. It's an observation. But it's an observation that drives all of the technology planning in the tech industry. And it's about doubling the number of transistors, halving the size of those transistors on an 18-month to two-year basis. And Moore's Law is what has driven the proliferation of computing in society. And it's all about cost. It's all about driving down the cost of computation. And part of the benefits of Moore's Law is there are energy efficiencies to be gained on a unit of work per unit of electricity basis that are a result of Moore's Law. I've mentioned this several times. One of the biggest drivers of greater efficiency on the device side, on the microstorage side, is the move towards mobile form factors. What you see here on the left-hand side is sort of the average kilowatt hours consumed per year, first instance of an unpower-managed, Pentium-based desktop computer with a CRT. And you all may never have owned a CRT computer, but trust me, I recently got rid of 4 of them that were in my garage. Finally decided it was time to recycle. Those CRTs in and of themselves suck a huge amount of electricity. The computers themselves were not managed for power at all, or virtually at all. But over time, there has been, partly through innovation, partly through regulation and the pressure of regulation, but largely through just the desire of consumers to go mobile and the requirements of the mobile form factor. We've gotten to a point where now these devices are extremely aggressively managed for efficiency. Every aspect of them, the design has an energy efficiency focus. Within my company, I manage a team of folks who worry about energy issues. And we have a group of 20 or so technologists within the company who are part of the design process. So they're working on the design of the chips that will go into products 4, 6, 8, 10 years from now. And really what my team does on this topic is we're bringing to those designers what we see as the trends in terms of government requirements. They know what the trends are in terms of what the customers require. But then they're telling us what's possible, what isn't possible, and that hopefully helps us avoid impossible requirements. But at the same time, the bigger challenge is to make sure that we're ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve in terms of energy efficiency. And I will say, in the last 10 years, we've gone from energy efficiency being a third-order priority in the design of our chips to being the most important issue. Even more important, which is unbelievable if I put my hat on from 10 years ago, even more important than the computing power because of the mobile form factor. Simply put, if this device were as efficient as the first generation of laptops and had the same compute power embedded in the CPU, I could not hold this. It would be too hot. And the battery life would be about 15 minutes. So that's obviously unacceptable. So let's focus on the macro story or intelligent efficiency. I've been doing presentations on this for the entire 15 years I've been at Intel, and I can tell you 10, 12 years ago, when I would tell people about this story, they would look at me like I had an eye in the center of my forehead. Because intuitively, again, people understand that these devices use energy. It was harder for them to understand that they actually could be used to save energy. But thankfully, and we've helped fund some of this work, but a lot of it has been done by others. There's a lot of evidence that's been generated over the last 5, 6 years to validate the story. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy started the ball rolling some years ago, and they looked at the 20-year period or 15-year period when the internet first started to proliferate in the economy in the U.S. And it turns out that was coinciding with a period when the energy efficiency of the U.S. economy was increasing dramatically. So we're not a terribly energy efficient economy, but we're a lot more energy efficient than we were 30 years ago. And a lot of that, through the statistical analysis that ACEEE did, can be tied causally to the effect of the internet. And an example of that, I tell from my own company standpoint, is 10 years ago, our supply chain was a paper-based supply chain. Today, it's completely an e-commerce supply chain. And the amount of money that we've saved and the amount of energy that we've saved by the efficiency driven by going completely electronic, completely digital, has been very substantial. And that's just one company example. That's very typical today. Logistics systems, supply chains are all going virtual. At some point, you've got to actually move goods, so it's not completely virtual, but what can be made virtual has been. And then groups like the Climate Group in London have taken a look at what the possibilities are. If you know climate change policy at all, you know one of the problems is there's no silver bullet, there isn't even half a dozen silver bullets, right? There's so many different sectors that contribute, and there's so many different things that we need to do differently, and so therefore so many different policy levers that need to be pulled, that it's part of the difficulty of making real progress. Well, it turns out, based upon some work that McKinsey's done, to identify the things you can do that are cheapest and easiest, and in some cases save money for society, are end-use energy efficiency activities to improve the end-use energy efficiency of everything that uses energy in the first instance. And it turns out that a lot of those things involve ICT and involve instrumentation. And based upon that fundamental analysis, the Climate Group has projected, the numbers are up there, 15%, 22% in the United States, of the contribution that ICT strategies can make. There aren't any other strategies out there that remotely approach that short of shutting down all fossil fuel consumption, which politically and economically isn't feasible. So ICTs have a huge role to play in the future. What you've got then is you've got proof that ICTs have made a contribution in the past because of the internet and end use efficiencies. Strong indication of much greater potential. You've got a gap, and the question really is, why does that gap exist? I'll get to that in a second. Those are all statistical studies. These are some of the applications, industrial robots, energy management buildings, smart motors, online entertainment. We've done an analysis in my company together with a guy at Stanford to show how much money is saved from digital download of music as opposed to what was traditional in my day and still is traditional in my house, which is the CD. On a,
what about records?
We didn't go back that far. On a per song basis, it's a small savings, but you multiply it across a year's worth of music purchases, and it adds up. One of my favorites is, and the importance of these applications varies by economy. We've done some work I'll talk about towards the end in China with the Chinese government. And it turns out, in a very industrialized economy like China, if they just implemented smart motors, variable speed motors, throughout Chinese industry, the amount of energy they would save and the amount of crap they would take out of the air would be very substantial.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
What
Please,
kind of investment would that be to do that? Like,
actually, not very substantial, because it turns out that variable speed motors is a technology that's been out there for decades, and it varies by the size of the motor. These are not things that you or I would pay for out of our out of our pocket. But
so the reluctance is not a financial one.
No, it's mostly, I'll get to it in a second. You've got this gap. Why does the gap exist? I think the gap exists because of market barriers and market failures. It's a classic case of economics. And the biggest failure out there is lack of information. There are other failures like the perceived upfront cost. Some of these technologies are a little more expensive upfront. I'll use a non-ICT example. Dan's heard me tell this anecdote. Complex for us at CFLs. Okay, I've got an MBA. I can do the discount cash flow analysis. I know when I go into the hardware store and see the expensive upfront cost of buying those bulbs, that the payback period is very quick. But psychologically, it still took me 3 or 4 years to get over that barrier. So if you're somebody who isn't used to thinking in terms of discount, cash flow, and ROI and payback period, people can be put off, and companies can be put off. One of the big issues is, there's this old joke about 2 University of Chicago economists going across campus, and they see a $20 bill. One of them sees a $20 bill on the path, and they say, "Look, there's a $20 bill," and the other economist says, "No, there's no $20 bill there." And the other guy, the first guy, says, "Oh, yes, there is." No, there isn't. Why won't you admit the obvious? And the second economist said, "Well, if there really was a $20 bill there, somebody would have picked it up." And the reality is, particularly in small and medium-sized companies, but even companies like mine, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that doesn't get harvested because, we're not an energy efficiency company. A small, medium-sized business, providing a service for, let's take the office, selling paper. They're not in the energy efficiency business. They're not spending a lot of time looking out for those $20 bills. So it's that lack of information is the number one barrier.
Isn't energy cheaper than it should be?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that is definitely a significant factor. But even if you changed, if you changed the price and reflected all the externalities, people would be more motivated to look for the $20 bills. But there are still some other barriers that, one of the classic barriers, veer off a little bit here, data centers. Everybody's paranoid about data centers. Data centers are what drive the efficiencies I'm talking about here because they are the hub of the network. But looked at in the micro, we need to get data centers to be as efficient, right, as possible. One of the reasons why data centers don't, data center efficiency, even though it can be huge cost savings for enterprises that have data centers or data closets. Data center people think of some huge facility. It could be a room in a building like this. The reason why, in a lot of cases, people don't find the $20 bills, or in some cases the $20,000 bills, is because there's one part of an organization that's responsible for running the data center, and they're evaluated in terms of reliability, right? So they want to have multiple redundancy. They don't mind it's running at 5% utilization, because they get paid and compensated on the basis of those 99.99999% reliability. Somebody else over on the financial part of the operation is paying the bill. And so you have the sort of principal agent issues that you get. Other examples like that in apartment houses where somebody building an apartment house or somebody building condos isn't necessarily motivated to make the place as efficient as possible because at the end of the day, they're not going to be paying the energy bill. There's also a renewable side to this story. There's a lot of technology needed to bring renewables onto the grid. Somebody managing an electricity grid has to manage on a second-by-second basis and get it just right, the amount of energy being demanded with the amount of energy being generated. And so when you talk about bringing intermittent sources of electricity on, like wind and like solar, unless you have massive capacity to store that electricity, which is something that currently doesn't exist in large scale. There's a huge amount of IT that's needed, not only to maximize the efficiency of the wind turbine and make sure that the blade is angled just the right way, but also to manage the dispatch of that electricity onto the grid. So that's another area in which IT plays a role. Here's another example of why data centers are your friend. Efficient data centers are your friend. Everybody talks about the cloud and big data. So I can't go anywhere without hearing the cloud and big data at least once a day, even on my sabbatical.
No relief.
No relief. And these are just buzzwords for things that have been around for a long time. The cloud is data center. The cloud is, instead of me managing my storage or me managing applications, I'm going to put it somewhere, somebody else is going to manage it. It turns out that the ability to manage data efficiently and to run data centers efficiently by somebody who's in the business of running data centers is a lot easier than if American University or my office decides, instead of putting something in somebody else's hands with the appropriate security and privacy assurances, I'm going to have 4 or 5 servers running in a closet in my office, or I'm going to have a room, in this building or some other building on campus that's going to be my data center. It turns out people who do this for a living are a lot better able to do it efficiently than people who don't do it for a living. And so the cloud, there have been a number of case studies that have shown that outsourcing this type of activity on its own yields a tremendous energy savings potential. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you feel like a similar kind of analogy to that is like electric cars, where you're managing maybe one power plant now and trying to make that more efficient than hundreds of millions of tailpipes and trying to make those more efficient?
Yeah. That's a complicated story, though, because good and bad. those electric vehicles are much more than just modes of transportation. They actually can be devices to store energy. They can be a device to store this intermittent. They can be sources of generation, depending on the time of day. But you're right in the frame that you provided, but there are also a lot of other complexities. The whole story around electric vehicles is almost more of an IT story than it is a transportation story per se. Some of these, there's a group called Project Better Place that's based in Israel, and they're in Israel and in Denmark. They're trying to set up basically society-wide infrastructure for plug-in electric vehicles, and it was founded by a guy who was formerly an executive at SAP, the big software, because it really is much more than transportation technology. It really is an IT and software challenge. So I mentioned several times market failures. I've just focused on the last one here: perceived small size of individual savings. A lot of times when you go to governments and you say, okay, there's fruit out there to be picked, they'll say, well, on an individual basis, it's not that significant. But the point is, as these devices are proliferated, it's a lot of small savings that add up to big potential.
Following up on
Yeah, go ahead.
How much of the energy used by ICT is used by the servers and transmission versus individual users, the consumers? In other words, it's really still a situation where we've met the enemy, he is us right now. And then what are the projections going forward, as more of what we do moves to the cloud?
The short answer to your question is I don't know the numbers. I know qualitatively we're moving from where the vast majority is being consumed at the client end. Me here, you at home, or somebody in an office. We add all of that up, that's much greater than the energy consumed in the servers, whether the servers are in data centers or on their own. As these devices get more efficient, and the servers are getting more efficient too, but the growth in the cloud is picking up to the point where I think we're going to reach a tipping point pretty soon, where most of the electricity is being consumed in the cloud, even though the cloud, the servers and the data centers are getting much more efficient. There's a group I would recommend, if you're part of it. It's a group that includes industry and NGOs and governments and customer organizations called the Green Grid. And if you're interested in what's going on in the cloud and the server and data center world, check out the Green Grid online. They're doing some really pretty dramatic things on a non-competitive basis to help. It's not just, some of it is making the servers more efficient, a lot of it is making the facilities, designing facilities to be more efficient.
Can you talk a little about that, and the siting, like how close do they have to be to customer right now?
That's actually a relatively small part of it, although it's not unimportant because of transmission distribution losses. They're working on many different fronts, but sort of a high level. The first is designs to make servers as efficient as possible and for them to operate at higher temperatures. And the issue in a data center is heat. Traditionally, heat is the enemy of these machines. And it's why if you have a Mac Pro, that was the first laptop to come out in a super thin form factor. The amount of, those machines have our chips in them. The amount of engineering that went into, on our end, and then between us and Apple, to enable thinner, they came out with a machine that was maybe a third as thick as the previous machine. They had our chips in them, not IBM's chips, and our chips were about 10 times more powerful in terms of computation, and theoretically could have been 10 times hotter. Apple didn't want a fan, and Apple certainly didn't want any cooling chemicals. You know, to have the chip encased in some hazardous chemicals was not anything that you had. So the amount of energy that went into designing that's the same kind of engineering that's now going into the design of the servers themselves. And so there are ways to design the servers so that you maximize airflow. There's work being done on the design of the rooms themselves to maximize airflow, using natural cooling, using renewable energy sources where you can. So siting them, it's more important in a lot of cases to site them where there's a clean source of energy than it is necessarily to site them close to the customer base, because the customers could be all over the world. And then one of the things we've done a little bit of work on is combined heat and power, and locating data centers where you have access to heat as well as electricity. And so there's a wide variety of things going on that are dramatically improving what's possible. The challenge is to bring what's out there up to something close to what's possible.
Yeah, I'm curious about like how difficult it is to get the location that you need, and how much you're using the grid, and whether or not the grid is up to par for the data centers, or not.
That's a huge location by location variable, right? I don't know, about a month ago there was a really bad story in the New York Times about data centers. There were two stories.
The diesel generators.
Yeah, the second story was about a Microsoft data center in this one location in this remote northwest town, and how they bullied the local, town fathers and town mothers. I can't speak to the truth of that story. The first story was, just basically about how much electricity data centers consume, but no mention of the role they play, and no mention of the work that's been done to advance the state of the art.
You're talking about the fact that the industry and consumers want reliability for access, especially if they're accessing data or they're collaborating, which isn't very efficient right now. Do you think the industry by itself will just move that direction, or was there a need, as you said, like a market failure, to require some level of efficiency over reliability?
I think there's a role for both. I think, and not just in the IT realm, but in the energy efficiency realm itself. In the absence of Energy Star, in the absence of requirements in Europe, the trend towards more mobile devices and the demands that places, that would have given us a lot of the progress we've seen. But that's progress along the high end. That's progress along the frontier of what's possible in the general direction of the market. Where government regulations, in my view, are especially needed is to bring up the bottom. And so what we advocate for at Intel is a combination of, you have minimum requirements that are popular, say, in Europe. So unless your device, and it's the system, it's not the CPU chip, unless your system is at least as efficient as X, you cannot sell your product in the market. So that cuts off the laggards. And then you have programs like Energy Star and the general direction of the market, which push, Energy Star is trying to set a voluntary aspirational goal. And over time, that brings up the entire market. But you do need, another example is, and it's I've gotten ahead of before we were talking about principal agent issues. You all probably mostly live in apartments, I don't know. But, if you're living in an apartment, the air conditioning unit, the heater, you don't go out and buy that, at Home Depot. your landlord has bought that. And depending on whether he or she is paying the bill or you're paying the bill, there may or may not be an incentive on their part to increase or maximize efficiency. But in a lot of cases, the people who buy the equipment are not the ones who ultimately pay the bill, so they don't have an incentive to pay the extra 15% to get the most efficient unit. And so they're having government minimum requirements, which we do now have in the Department of Energy for air conditioning units, that makes sure that there's a minimum. Then there are other ways to approach it, like in the automobile. We have CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economies, where they don't, if you want to sell a Bentley or a Maserati that gets, 5 gallons to the mile, you can do that, but, the average has to be a certain minimum across the fleet. Let me touch, so if there are these gap between potential and actual, this is because of market failures. Market failures typically are an argument for government policy. What kinds of government policies? The first here is a national roadmap or a strategy to guide policy direction. And this is what they have in Japan. We're doing some work in Japan, where Japan has identified what they call green of IT, which is the greenness of the device, and green by IT, which is what I've been talking about. And in China, I'll end with what we're doing with the Chinese government. They've decided to make this intelligent efficiency a key part of the 13th five-year plan, which they're working on now. And they're working with a group that I head to identify what policies that means in practical terms. Lead by example. Governments are the biggest landowners, biggest employers, biggest fleet operators, biggest building managers in every economy you can name. And so governments do the right thing. Shine a spotlight, document their savings, shine a spotlight on that. Then there can be great progress. I was at a meeting yesterday with several offices of the White House. We are trying to get President Obama to issue an executive order that requires EPA, not EPA, the federal government, to, they're required already to buy Energy Star computers, for example, but we want them to be required to use their more efficient devices in a more efficient way to make their buildings more efficient, make their fleets more efficient, etc. Whether we'll get there or not, I don't know, but for the first time, as of yesterday, we seem to have gotten some traction. It was funny, the meeting was scheduled 2 months ago, and we knew it was either going to be a productive meeting like it was, or it was going to be a wait one of the two, depending on how the election turned out. Fostering markets, government procurement, again, government leading by example. Empowering consumers, lack of information is the biggest barrier here. The administration is doing some interesting things under their Open Energy Initiative, Open Information Initiative. And I recommend if you want to Google that and check out some of the things they're doing, particularly related to energy and health. You have a question? Okay. In the energy realm, they've got something called the Green Button Initiative, where they're working with utilities to make if your utility opts in, you will have access on as real-time a basis as they collect it to your energy usage information. And the idea is that has already started to generate a lot of app development, for smartphones and other devices. Broadband. This is all about the network, and broadband availability is critical. There have been several efforts at the national and international level to make the case that broadband is key to what the Japanese call green by IT. And then we used to talk a lot about establishing incentives and rewards for investment in green ICT. We still do a little bit. For example, working with state utility commissions. California is the best example. They have money set aside where consumers get a little bit of a subsidy if they go out and replace their 6-year-old pretty inefficient PC with a new modern PC. We benefit, we sell new product, society benefits because energy consumption goes down. We don't talk about this too much now at the federal level because there's not a whole lot of money to go around for tax incentives and other kinds of policies. I mentioned broadband. What I want to end on is to talk about a group that we founded about 5 years ago. Dan will vouch for me. Every initiative I've ever been involved in my career where I've had a hand in naming the initiative, the names have all been pretty crappy. Maybe I should have been a marketing student. So we founded something called the Digital Energy and Sustainability Solutions Campaign, or DESC. That was the best of about a dozen different options. So, but I'll show you DESC. This is DESC in the U.S. DESC is a lot of major IT companies. It's co-chaired by myself and a colleague from Verizon. We also have companies like Johnson Controls. Johnson Controls is not an IT company, but there's a lot of IT in their product. Schneider Electric is another example of that. And then we have a number of climate and energy NGOs, ACEEE, I mentioned, the Alliance to Save Energy, Climate Group, and several others, and then a few trade associations. What we're about, and we have an affiliate here, we have an affiliate in China, and we're currently, we had an affiliate in India that petered out, but we're now working with the UN to try and establish equivalent organizations in 3 or 4 places around the world. We're working on Japan, India, the European Union, possibly Russia, and possibly southern cone of South America. If you want to, you can't really see it there, but if you go to www.digitalenergysolutions.org, it's a pretty good portal for what's going on in this space. What we basically, these are the companies that are part of DESC China. What we do are really on 2 broad umbrellas. Number 1, tell the story. If lack of information is the biggest need, the biggest problem here, let's get the information out there. The second thing we do is work on development policies. We work with the governments to develop policies that attack these market failures and hopefully close the gap. In China, I'm particularly proud of what we've done in China. Going back almost 2 years ago now, we did a report with the Chinese government looking at how ICT can help China achieve its objective of reducing the carbon intensity of its economy. And we had a huge conference to launch this report. It was one of the funnest times in my career because separate from that, we were one of 7 companies that got an energy efficiency award from the Chinese government. I didn't know this was going to happen, but during the conference when the award was given, we marched up onto the stage to the theme song from the Magnificent Seven. I'm not going to whistle it, but if you don't recall it immediately, if somebody here could whistle it, you'd remember it immediately because it's been used in a lot of different places. But I didn't know it until that time, but that was one of my objectives in my life. That was on my bucket list to march up on the stage somewhere to the Magnificent Seven. But what we're doing with the Chinese government now is we're particularizing this. We're trying to get more granular. They want to make intelligent efficiency part of the next 5-year plan, as I mentioned, and we're working with them to define what exactly that means in terms of specific policies. So the final thing I'll end with is I mentioned we used to be DES, Digital Energy Solutions. We've added another S, Sustainability, to capture the fact that the same story about how ICT can be part of the solution applies in the water realm. And so we're starting to work with others and find this term, the smart water grid. How can instrumentation be used, for example, to spot where leakages occur in a water system? Even in fairly young American cities, 40% of the water is drawn out of wherever the water source is, gets leaked through the pipes. Water is where climate stress is already being felt first. And so we think there's a huge linkage there, and also it takes a lot of water to produce energy. There's a lot of energy required to provide water, so there's a close linkage there. And what we're doing specifically, and I'll end with this, is we've given a grant to a group I'm working with on my sabbatical called the Chesapeake Conservancy. And they're doing two things under two separate grants, one from DESC, one from Intel. Under the DESC grant, they're working on what we're calling precision conservation. So the Conservancy is a group that tries to go in and identify land areas that should be left not just undeveloped, but where stream buffers or other kinds of protective action should be taken to keep runoff, whether it's urban runoff or agricultural runoff, from getting into the Chesapeake Bay. And traditionally, groups would go in and say, pay a farmer to put in along a half a mile of stream bed, a forest buffer, or some other kind of buffer that ideally would filter out the nutrients. We're looking at under this project, we're looking at technologies that very precisely can identify using Landsat data and software packages where does the runoff actually occur. It doesn't occur along a half-mile stretch. It maybe occurs in this 50-foot section, in this 30-foot section, in this 100-foot section. So put the buffers in there at less expense, and again, precision conservation. We're looking at some other there's interest in what's called nutrient trading, right? So 60% roughly of the crap going into Chesapeake Bay is from agriculture, but virtually all of the effort to improve the water quality is being devoted to making sewer systems and water treatment systems in the urban locations more effective. Well, we're at the point where that's hugely expensive on a per marginal unit of improvement basis. So there's interest in setting up trading systems where instead of municipalities spending 100 units, $100 million, whatever it would be to have an incremental effect, letting them trade with farmers, pay farmers to put in forest buffers to accomplish the same or greater impact at much less cost. There are a huge number of issues related to doing that, one of which is how can you be sure that buffer will remain? How can you be sure that buffer is effective? If you're talking a point source like a water treatment plant, it's very easy to tell what the before and after difference is of your investment. It's much harder with agriculture or forest land. So we're looking at technology and how technologies can be used to verify the performance. And we think if we can get there with a lot of other safeguards and lots of complexities involved, we create a system where we can much more rapidly clean up the Chesapeake Bay and restore it to something like its previous biological productivity at much lower cost to society. So that's the goal. Whether we get there or not, who knows? But yeah.
I work in our Office of Sustainability, and I got my start at the Alliance to Save Energy. So energy efficiency is near and dear to my heart. But actually, I was debating with my boss this morning about how energy efficiency, while important, obviously, we'd be using a lot more energy as a culture than we do now, if not for energy efficiency. It's not necessarily getting us to sustainability as far as evening out or reversing growth. And it's kind of the rebound effect. If you're more efficient, you can in China you can produce more goods, your economy grows, or wherever. So I guess philosophical question, is efficiency a sustainability tactic in the end, do you think, or is it just a virtue?
A couple of responses to that. First is like you're asking one of the right questions. I guess my visceral immediate response is, what's the alternative?
Right.
Right. So I think the rebound effect has been vastly overstated. And I know ACEEE has done some pretty interesting work. There is a rebound. The rebound effect, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is the idea of whether as a company or as a society or as an individual, I spent $1,000 to put in a lot more attic insulation in my house 2 years ago, so my electricity and heating bills are lower. And so, do I use that money I saved to then buy a bigger refrigerator, or to run the furnace more? You just sort of use more because you're saving money. I think the evidence overall is that there is a little bit of a rebound, but not a significant rebound. I think efficiency is part of turning the curve. Climate change, whether we're going to get to 2 degrees or where will we end up getting, we've got to change the shape of the curve from this to this in terms of carbon emissions. And one of my old professors at Princeton, Rob Stockwell, has done an analysis called policy wedges, and I referred to it earlier as the easiest, cheapest, first thing that you should do are end-use efficiencies. You don't do that, you have no hope of ever changing the slope of that curve. So again, my general response is, what's the alternative? It's necessary but not sufficient would be another way to phrase that, I think.
Can you talk a little about the materials that are going into ICT products today, and what has been identified as troublesome potentially in the future, and how intensive it is for some of those resources?
Well, if you talk at the system level, I can answer at the system level versus at the chip level. So one of the biggest issues of late has been so-called rare earths. And the Chinese government has been playing hardball. Rare earths turn out to be very rare. It's a classic example of economics. The price has been low historically, and so there has been a lot of incentive for people to exploit rare deposits where they exist. The one economy that has done a good job has been China. So many of the rare earths, which do play a role in a number of high-tech products in small concentrations, the Chinese have pretty much a lock on the market. But because of the tactics that they've employed of putting limits on what can be exported and the price impacts of that in the markets for these materials, the price has gone up, and now mines are starting to reopen in Canada and Australia. And so that's
Mountain Pass is open too.
Huh?
Mountain Pass is
Yeah.
open.
Yeah. And I think the Chinese over time will figure that out. They're smart. Let me address one issue that we're spending a lot of time on right now, which I think is one of the more significant issues in terms of real societal impact that I've ever dealt with in my career, and that's conflict minerals. Conflict minerals are tin and tantalum and gold and a couple of others. Just like conflict diamonds, these are mined, among other places, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they're good mines and bad mines. But the bad mines involve children being enslaved, forced to work, women getting raped and killed. I'll contrast it. 15 years ago, 12 years ago, we were required as an industry by the European Union to get lead out of solder and electronic products. The amount of lead in the electronic solder was minuscule. It wasn't not like lead paint or lead in gasoline back in the day, where there was an easy pathway to the human, and there weren't any easy substitutes. And finally, the substitutes generally were worse than lead. So that's an example in my career of stupid, wasteful, $7 billion expense imposed by dumb government regulation. Over here, you've got conflict minerals, where people are getting killed, where it's really important. What the issue is, by far, the vast amount of these minerals end up in jewelry or end up in automobiles. Those are the two biggest markets. But because high-tech companies have huge brand names, particularly Apple and Intel, the NGOs who are concerned about this issue have come after our industry. And the challenge for us is there are 7 or 8 steps between the mine and when the materials that are derived from the ore come to our front door or our back door. And so it's been very difficult for us, and it's hard to get to the mine mouth because bullets are flying. There increasingly is a happy ending to the story, led by a couple of companies, including Intel. We now are getting a much better sense of where our stuff is coming from. And we're putting pressure on the supply chain to document that we're not there yet. Right now, under some SEC requirements, you have to declare whether your stuff is conflict-free or not. And the only way to 100% guarantee you're conflict-free is to buy stuff from smelters, to trace your supply chain smelters in Canada or Australia. They're not getting their ore from Africa, you can be pretty sure of that. But anywhere in Europe or Africa or even the Middle East, there's a pretty good chance that the ore that goes to those smelters is coming from the DRC. And you can't guarantee, because we haven't yet been able to get down to the mine mouth, and you can't distinguish ore coming from a good mine here from ore coming from a bad mine half a mile away. Right now, what companies are doing in order to be able to certify they're conflict-free is they're avoiding Africa entirely. And so the good mines and the bad mines are both getting punished. We're about a year away from, we think, working with the United Nations and the State Department to be able to get information down to the mine mouth. So that we think within a year we'll be able to source from African smelters, again, through these chains of the supply chain, and be able to certify that we're conflict-free. That's where we want to get. So we're punishing the bad mines, but not the good mines.
The mines, would you say, were conflict-free?
Conflict-free, yeah. In other words, there's no slavery, So that's the biggest issue we face right now from a material standpoint. And again, something that's a real problem.
Conflict materials, one of the things I'm really interested in, and I was just wondering if your company is doing anything specific about it, like if you guys try to partner with organizations that, or companies that say their materials are conflict-free, or they know for sure it's not coming from Africa. Like, does that play a role in who you work with at all, or does it come down to money?
Yeah, we chair a group called EICC. Whose job it is to drive non-conflict-free materials out of the supply chain. But again, because of the difficulty down at the mine level of distinguishing ore, we're not quite there yet. So it's it's a top priority. I mean, if you go on our website and type in conflict minerals, you'll see a very strong statement. And if you look at what we're doing, and not just us, but other companies as well, there's a group called the Enough Project that's led the charge in the NGO in. They recently came out with a ranking of companies on this issue. We were first in their ranking. They gave us a grade of 60. And so I thought it's kind of a strange curve. And in part that 60 out of 100 and we're the best reflects how difficult closing that 40% is. I think they're also maybe a little harsh graders, but you know, it is a top priority, and it's all, it can't be done by an individual company because the supply chains are so, you know, we have 85% of the computing market, but in the content minerals market, we're hardly noise, right? We can't, you know, Intel unto itself doesn't have a big enough lever to make an impact when name any jewelry company that has a store in the mall, you know, they're buying thousands of times more of this stuff than we are.
Yeah. So I know that when Apple first was like engineering their MacBook Air, did they approach Intel and ask them to create a specific processor that was like not only like small but also more energy efficient than like the ones that they already offered? Is that true?
It's half true. That's what I was alluding to earlier. Okay, I'll see you, Mom. You know, they came to us because our products at the time were much more powerful than the so-called Power PC chip that Motorola and IBM were producing, that they had used for generations of products. So that's why they came to us. The problem was that they had just taken one of our chips that we were selling into thicker form factors, you know, with other OEMs. It wouldn't have fit. And big issue is heat dissipation. So, you know, this thing, as efficient as it is, has a little fan in it. You barely feel that there's a fan. And there are only three ways to dissipate heat. One is sort of organically through the substrate, right? Which, if you've got very thin substrate, is hard to do. With a fan, or by using some kind of chemical, you know, you have some chemicals in there that are coolants. And we don't like the chemical solution. The OEMs generally don't either, and Apple didn't want it. Yeah. One more question.
Oh, well.
No, but I've got a signal behind you.
Okay.
I was actually gesturing to somebody who's behind you.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, after this one more question would be.
So what happened was we got approached and we said yes. They were 2% or less of the market at the time, but we always wanted them as a customer for obvious reasons. And so we sent an engineering team of a couple hundred people off with some of their folks and spent, I think it was about a year and a half, designing ways to dissipate the heat. It's not so much that we changed our chip. The chip that is in the MacBook Air is the same chip that goes in the other thin form factor devices of that era shortly after that era of other OEMs. The big thing we did with them and then replicated with our other customers is finding ways to dissipate heat through thin substrate. Now, you'll see we've invented this product called the Ultrabook, which the first generation Ultrabooks were kind of mediocre. The new ones are very cool. My daughter's waiting for one for Christmas. They're super thin. They're thinner than the Mac Air. Okay.
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
With the detachable?
What?
With the detachable?
No, it's a Samsung.
Okay, well the new
Where
ones
the battery's built into it.
The new ones are even thinner than that, and the screens are detachable, and the screens become pads.
Wow.
So it's a combination of a laptop and a pad.
Oh, I've seen the advertisement for that on TV.
But the issue, there's an issue related to that, the device you have there. And no, with the Mac Airs, and this is an example of a materials issue that we faced. One of the ways those things are so thin battery is glued in, and there's no mechanical interface or connection. And that allows, if you don't have the screw and you have glue, that allows just a little bit of extra thinness. And that's what Apple has demanded. And the NGOs now are going after Apple hammer and tong because
They walked away, right, from
Yeah.
the standards.
from EP, they've come back.
Yeah, they got back, but it's still a little odd how that happened.
Right. Well, the two issues are, ideally, you want to be able to, exchange your battery and get a better battery, right? If it's glued in and you can't do that, okay? And then the second is, if it's glued in, it's hard to recycle. So, and the Ultrabooks, like yours, have it glued in. And so my team are telling our designers, guys, we're going to lose this. We cannot say, well, recycling be damned, we want to get, a 100th of a millimeter of extra thinness by not having a screw or some other mechanical attachment. We are going to have to give up on this idea that batteries have to be permanently glued in. We haven't won that fight yet, but that's an example of where my team and I are looking at the external world and trends and trying to advise the product planners and designers because we want to avoid issues to the extent we can. One last question.
I kind of like a bigger picture question. I was just basically wondering. I know in the past, stereotypically, there's been this this image and feeling that what is environmentally friendly and sustainable is not always what's most cost effective and efficient, and that I don't know that tree huggers generally want to do things for this world that generally aren't always for the best benefit for profit companies. So I was wondering where along the development are we where products like let's say for companies like Intel and some of the companies that you work for, what you're trying to create. The cost for something that is sustainable, environmentally friendly, is also what is most cost-effective and efficient. Where is that bridge right now? Is it still kind of what's sustainable is not what's most cost-effective and efficient, or are they kind of where along that development of meeting those two ends are we right now?
See, I start with a different premise. Maybe we're seeing different data, or maybe because I've been at this for a long time, I'm starting from a different baseline. I think this environment versus economy debate is a little broader than you framed it, is light years ahead of where it was when I started my career even 15 years ago. I think that there's a much broader acceptance in business that the two can go hand in hand.
Oh, I agree. I just feel like sometimes there's still somewhat of a disagreement there.
Well, I think in some cases there are. I mean, in some cases, the thing that's the most sustainable is in the short run, it does have a higher upfront cost, and so therefore you cut out a big part of the market. We've had issues with the European Union in the past on some environmental regulations, not Intel, but the industry, where they start out aiming for this, but they want Energy Star, which is voluntary, to be mandatory. And we said, well, that's great, except that you understand that it's the top 50%, the most expensive, actually it's top 25%, the most expensive 25% of the products out there that meet Energy Star, and they're more expensive in part because of the engineering to make them meet Energy Star. If you say, my consumers can't have access to the other 75%, which is typically less expensive, what's the trade-off in terms of your consumers? But I think fundamentally, sustainability is about getting rid of waste. In general, when you get rid of waste, you can save money. So I think more often than not, the two can't be aligned.
Great. Well, we're out of formal time right now. I'm sure
Folks want
people have a few more questions. We can stick around afterwards. But I just want to thank Mr. Harper again for coming in and spending his time talking to us about what's really a fascinating topic. If you want to hear about more events like this from both the Office of Sustainability and other organizations on campus, you can actually get on our email listserv. Otherwise, thanks again for coming, and keep saving energy.